good?
Yeah, it's good.
Okay. Where should we begin?
I don't know.
Do you think I should go with this?
Yeah.
Good. Bismillah, Sidi.
Yeah.
Camera. All right. Worst possible things that could happen. That's actually perfect. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين والطاهرين ورضي أصحابه أجمعين برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. أما بعد رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي واجعلي وزيرا من أهل هارون أخي أشدد به أزري. أما بعد ألم نشرح لك صدرك ووضعنا عنك وزرك الذي أنقض ظهرك ورفعنا لك ذكرك صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. Thank you for your patience. Inshallah, we'll try to proceed from where we left off. At some point, I might we will have a guided meditation, inshallah. Probably after I give a summary to some extent. So in the next 15 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes, inshallah. So what we did last night was that we covered a lot of ground in terms of the topic of practical Sufism, meaning what is Sufism? And we discussed there's what one could say is two branches of Sufism, or the discipline of Sufism, and the first being that of practical Sufism, what I'm titling in practicing or in practical Sufism, which is the ilm al-mu'amalat of Sufism, of tasawwuf. And there is, of course, the ilm al-kashafat. One could say a subcategory, and so the first is practical Sufism, or the practices of Sufism, or Sufism in practice. And the ilm al-kashafat is the science of unveilings, as it concerns tasawwuf, or Islamic spirituality. And we had an extensive discussion regarding the distinctions between the two, and how the former practical Sufism is more or less accepted across the board of Islamic scholarship. As at the least essential from the point of view of tazkiyah to nafs, purification of the soul. Although much of Sufism goes certainly beyond simply or only purification of the soul, in regards to an initiatic or spiritual connection to a spiritual teacher, and more or less, more or less by the method, awakening the verities of the spiritual heart, the marvels of the spiritual heart, to quote Imam al-Ghazali, who speaks of the ajaib al-qulub. And much of that is awakened. The perception, or like the organ of spiritual perception that is the heart, the qalb itself, is awakened by spiritual practice. So much of ilm al-mu'amalat has to do with this. In regards to practical Sufism. And so we'll, of course, much of what we're talking about is going to be about that, the mukashafat has to do with the science of unveilings. More or less, in a nutshell, that which begins occurring for some wayfarers as they awaken their inner faculties of consciousness in regards to their connection to the divine presence. So this term unveilings and includes intimate, inspired thoughts, inspired intimations with God in terms of insights, spiritual insights that come from God or the angels, and so forth, and spiritually witnessing the subtle lights or the lights, angelic lights and lordly lights, which may occur as a kind of mystical tasting in Islamic spirituality. Of course, not being the goal of spirituality, the goal really being for Islamic spirituality of knowing God intimately, and by that actually knowing your real self. That one could say is the goal of Sufism, if we wish to label or call something a goal. So so we highlighted those two, and we spoke about the ambiguities in al-Kashifat and some of the problematics or just challenges with interpreting or with experiencing the unveilings and thereby also interpreting them, or how to interpret them, which really has much to do with having a connection with the spiritual teacher, who, by their insight, by their awakened spiritual insight, their basira, in connection to their teachers, et cetera, can help one, navigate the intimations or spiritual experiences of the ahwal or spiritual states that one may have on, upon the path. So we discussed this kind of briefly, but the challenges of that, and how sometimes unveilings can be misinterpreted, and hence the importance and the need for parameters, which of course are the Quran and the Sunnah, but also terminology and also insight into the individual soul. So all this is the privy of that which is not found in books. And so it's important to mention that also, and that which is found in suhbah, in spiritual companionship, or initiatic companionship with a teacher. So that, in a nutshell, is a summary of what we spoke about in terms of the distinction of these two aspects of Sufism, and we are going to be focusing on practical Sufism. And much of the esoteric doctrine or the subtle kind of thinking or thoughts or subtle understandings of the Sufis really is under the realm of the ilm al-Makashifat. Some of that is important. Much of it, a lot of it is important. In fact, all of it is for the one who's obviously having unveilings. But in as far as one communicates them, the that aspect of Sufism has an attraction for seekers. And I can speak of even my own self, that was who was interested in Sufism by reading these aspects of spiritual doctrine or esoteric teachings of the Sufis, which was very enlightening for my mind and for the intellect, kind of awakened a certitude or a need to kind of seek this and to verify this by direct experience. So these kind of subtle insights into the teachings of Islam in regards to the subtle or mystical or spiritual nature of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, etc., and even doctrines like Wahdat al-Wujud, etc., and what this really means and this profundity was very important for my own personal journey. It may not be important for everyone, but there are certain soul types that are interested in these sort of things, and for those soul types, it captures their mind and helps turn that mind inward, and allows this kind of enlightened contemplation in the realm of thought and thinking to actually occur. And so obviously it has a value and it has a purpose, beyond those who have these unveilings. It is the communication of them. And you often find this either in private circles with the teacher and student, and or from the writings of the great sages who have over the years gained or have been deemed to be authoritative representatives of this Makashafat aspect of Sufism. Point in case is a figure like in Ibn Arabi, or someone like this, who's, again, since we're dealing with a science and insights that are subtle, they may not be for everyone, or even for those who are interested, they may not understand them. as well. They may actually misunderstand them. Usually what happens is they have a subtle understanding of them. They have some insight into it, and as they complement their spiritual understanding with spiritual practice, and as they purify themselves and their spiritual heart, they begin to see and discern more clearly what these sages are speaking of. And so it serves even that function as a kind of roadmap of awareness and kind of knowing where we have been and where we are now, even spiritually. So it most certainly has a definite function and a positive function, but it also has its challenges and it can have its loopholes also. And so there are certain Sufi orders that emphasize more this kind of tasawwufi nazari, this kind of theoretical Sufism. And it's, of course, meant for those soul types that are deeply intellectual, but obviously need a path of purification, and their ilmul yaqeen, that their sense of knowledge of certainty won't be satisfied until that they have drank from this kind of sea and ocean of enlightened certitudes, which are subtle pointers to the doctrines of spiritual Islam or Islamic spirituality. And so it serves an important function for such kinds of seekers, and it also serves an important function for perhaps those who are more advanced on the path, as a means of kind of verifying what they're experiencing, and as a kind of mirror for them. So Allahu Ta'ala alam, and God knows best. So I wanted just to complete my discussion of that by mentioning that it does have a positive sense, but that we are focusing on practical Sufism here, and that for every salik on the path, for any seeker, the most important thing is practice. Putting into practice what you know by your insight, so that your insight and your in-seeing is opened even more and is clarified, so that you begin to actually see and know more. And and it's just a beautiful kind of circle of back and forth. What one could say is this kind of mirror of a very subtle doctrine and spiritual method, which is the privy of Sufism. So I wanted to mention that some orders emphasize those things more, some less, and some stick with doctrine simply, of course, being theological doctrine as understood, for example, in Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, and following entirely the Sunnati practices, and from here speaking about the mukashafat and these sort of insights with one's teacher. So some of that aspect occurs more privately, right? And there's an emphasis in the more normative and more, you could say, mainstream Orthodox Sufi orders on practical Sufism, kind of almost alone, and not even delving into the ilm al-kashafat, because it in principle may not even be necessary for the sincere salik who is purifying their heart, and they have a teacher who can help them navigate their own awakening of inner discernment regarding the subtleties and the subtle realities of the Prophet ﷺ, of the awliya, etc., etc. But then again, you have other orders that emphasize these things, and everyone has their own starting point. The whole point is that all sincere salikun, or seekers upon the path, they meet inwardly in the spiritual heart. And here, all the seekers and all the orders are one. They return to the spiritual heart, and they return to a fuller appreciation of the prophetic presence, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and so this is where they meet. So let's let us before we turn to where we left off, and this was the first hikam, and my intention is to go over this hikam and Ibn Ajiba's commentary of Ibn Ata'iLlah's hikam. This first hikam, and his is very, very comprehensive. And then perhaps to say something about the second hikam here, and then skip many hikams and go to a hikam that has to do with spiritual retreat and the heart. Inshallah, if I have the time for tonight, I'll cover all of that. Most likely that may not happen. And then tomorrow I'll cover the rest of that in regards to the hikams. I wanted to actually go over the final hikam. So overall four. The fourth one would be the famous hikam on the remembrance of God and the process of the remembrance, which I think is very deeply practical. So all of these being practical, inshallah. And then after we have finished this, as I had mentioned, we will turn to the writings of Sayyidah Aisha al-Ba'uniyah al-Qadiri, and just go one day at a time on her sections on the principles of Sufism, which are really the practices of Sufism. And that I think will interest all of you, especially in regards to practical Sufism, and what is to actually be done upon the path. This is more of an overview and insights into the path of shukr of the Shadilis, for example, and this emphasis on gnosis and also self-knowledge, where you are and what God is in the path, upon the path. And so I hope that this is helpful. So let's turn now to, inshallah, just a very brief guided meditation, inshallah. And what I'd like to do for today, and really as a reminder for those who are here, and I spoke a little about this earlier in the afternoon to those who were present. Some have left, and of course there's people who come in and they go. That's the beauty of the itikaf. Some friends come, some students come, some family come, and they benefit for a day or two, and then they leave. And we pray that they received the nourishment that they were destined for, spiritual nourishment, not just physical nourishment. But both. And then there's some of you, mashallah, who stay for the whole, itikaf. So what I'm going to say now pertains to you all who have been here from the beginning. Alhamdulillah, we're more or less halfway into itikaf, and there is physical fatigue and a sense of the nafs, which has been more or less somewhat, broken in to the reality of the spiritual retreat, to want its space back, kind of inside of you. It doesn't want to just be secluded. Obviously, it wants to be in the world. It wants to express itself in a certain way. And so much of that has been worked on. And so this can be taxing for the nafs. And this can begin unconsciously affecting us, or subconsciously, in terms of the coming up of strange emotions or heavy feelings sometimes. Even feelings of loneliness, or anything that we've been working on psycho-emotionally or spiritually. And it's important to always have, a teacher around if there's any overwhelming emotions or any interesting thoughts that may be occurring, or very beautiful insights to kind of to discuss in companionship with the teacher. So among the challenges, which that being one of them in terms of the nafs, is to really feel that one has entered this realm or the spiritual arena of meditation, which will be a part of a hikam that we will speak of. And to really feel that we've now halfway in, that we have some kind of existential taste, a doke of what is meant by the spaciousness and the vastness of contemplative silence. Very important for the sadiq, or the one who is in retreat, to taste this, and not just for a moment, but for a longer period of time, so that it is instilled in the soul, so that the intellect and that the heart can discern more the nature of this inherent and even evoked, silence, and how there's something of that nature that points to what we really are as a spiritual presence, beyond the chattering of the mind and the hadith and nafs, and our involvement even in our outward speech with others. There should be something that has opened in the heart in an isolated retreat like itikaf, that we should have tasted bi'idhnillah, by the permission of God, by now to some degree. And something of this should be intended to be taken back with us into the world as we return to the world. Understanding that we will not feel perhaps the transparency and the clarity and the lightness and the spiritual opening that we may be experiencing in itikaf. So it's also the halfway point is an important time in our muhasaba to check this and see where we are in that. And if we feel that we're lacking in this, to do a little bit perhaps more work before we leave it to call, especially if you're staying for in the full 10 days. And if you've tasted it and you're thankful unto Allah for that, to begin, first of all, asking God to increase the benefit from the very little that we've done to deserve any of that, first and foremost, in terms of humility. And then to reflect deeply on how can I bring this awakened presence of heart into my life, back into the world, back into all the roles that God has placed me in my life, all the roles, from being a child to being a sibling to being a spouse to being a neighbor to being a professional peer, intellectual peer, academic peer, etc. I mean, all of this is very important, and it's a time of deep introspection and reflection on how can we bring this. And this is not just something that is an intellectual exploration or contemplative exploration. It is something that we ask in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as we've deepened in our silent intimacy with Allah in the heart, what I call the prayer of the heart, which combines the adhkar and the dua as well, the supplication, into a deep state of meditative and contemplative presence. We should learn this art and learn to carry this art and to revisit it at times, perhaps in the night vigils that we do outside of itikaf, in the tahajjud prayers, which is a beautiful time to actually be open unto and sit in a kind of intimacy with the divine presence in and as our presence of heart, right, which has been cultivated here. So all of this is very important. And so what I'd like to do for this particular guided meditation is to focus a little bit more on the sense of stillness and silence, especially to evoke a sense of inner listening to God's dialogue with us. And so the way we're going to do this is we're going to enter silence with some support of the conscious breath and the sensing of the breath. And then we will begin a very, very modified form of a wird, in which we'll say Astaghfirullah 100 times. Then Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad 33 times. And then La ilaha illallah 33 times. Now, in between each of these times, we will pause. We'll go into silence. And it's important to notice the quality of your silence each time, and to try to listen, turn your attention inwards even more, and surrender it unto the all-encompassing presence of God, and begin to, in this relaxed surrendering, to begin to try to listen to the divine call from within. This is what I call the prayer of the heart. The yearning of the heart, the prayer of the heart, and God's communication with us, his munajat, his intimate discourses with us, to just at the least be open for this possibility inwardly. And so we're going to start in silence, then do these invocations, and in between each of them, we can pause again for a few moments. This should take, inshallah, no more than 10 minutes. All right, Bismillah. Simply be present. Be present as yourself, and be present for Allah. Take a deep breath in and out. In and out. With the help of the sensing of the breath, begin to, with each breath, especially the out breath, begin to notice the quality of the silence that is already present. Bismillah. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. وما تقدموا لأنفسكم من خير تجدوه عند الله هو خير وأعظم أجر استغفر الله إن الله غفور رحيم. أستغفر الله 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 العظيم الذي لا إله إلا هو الحي القيوم وأتوب إليه إن الله In your silence, notice the quality of your silence after istighfar. Simply notice the quality of your heart and how perhaps in some way it is more open to engage in dialogue with Allah Ta'ala after istighfar. إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد. 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 اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد عبدك ورسولك النبي الأمي وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما. Notice again the quality of the silence and perhaps the spaciousness and the vastness of the heart that is spiritually embellished by the presence of the salawat upon the Prophet. Stay here for a moment as you feel somehow that you have presenced the divine love and the divine attention by your salawat. Try to feel the quality of the spaciousness of your heart and a sense of intimacy with the one subhanahu wa ta'ala whose attention that you have at this moment. Bismillah. Simply also feel the angels washing your heart that you have attracted by this salawat upon the Prophet. Washing your heart from that which is other than God and embellishing it with the attention and the love and the care of God. Try to feel the ease of this, of the lightness of this, the grace of this. شهد الله أنه لا إله إلا هو والملائكة وأولو العلم قائما بالقسط لا إله إلا هو العزيز الحكيم إن الدين عند الله الإسلام لا إله إلا الله 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 سيدنا محمد رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. Notice again of the silence, the quality of the silence and the spaciousness and the clarity of the heart after the Shahada, after negating with La ilaha everything that is other than Allah in your heart, all that which occupies your heart that is other than Allah, by negating that by the nafi of the La ilaha, of the Shahada, and then affirming God's presence of oneness in and as the heart. Notice the clarity of insight now that the heart has. Turn your attention by surrendering more inwards to this clarity and begin to listen to the presence of God's oneness and feel intimate with God's presence. Try to listen to the intimate discourse of God's presence in and as the silence of the heart. Bismillah. For the silence as a barzakh both veils and unveils God's presence and intimacy with you. Try to stay with this, or at least a part of it. Thank Allah for what you have discovered or returned to as we return to discussing our topic for today. بإذن الله. Al-Fatiha. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. Alhamdulillah. I hope that was helpful. Went for about perhaps, not sure how long there, 15 minutes or so. Perhaps. Inshallah. So we're at the 40-minute mark, and so we'll intend to take the remainder of the time and speak about the topics at hand, inshallah. So the Hikam was in English. A sign of your reliance on action is losing hope when you slip up or when you make mistakes. And we spoke about part of the commentary here and its comprehensiveness in regards to understanding that in the path, in the spiritual path, it is not your works that bring you to the divine presence. It is your attitude and your awareness of the mercy of God and His generosity. And with this awareness or this spiritual orientation, any kind of striving with our spiritual practice turns into an expression of gratitude for the blessings that we already have and for the deep, profound, and infinite blessings of Islam and Islam's spirituality. When we reorient our spiritual practice in this way, there is a kind of subtle shift that occurs between what one could call a path of striving, or our sense of trying to reach a goal or to reach God, to a kind of transformation, or this kind of shift into an awareness that God is already near, and He's not far. He's already near. And then a sense of simply surrendering in Iman and in faith, and beginning an expression of our gratitude for this insight and for the grace of His nearness by simply following the path of the Messenger of God, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And this then shifts our relationality, our relationship, or the nature of our relationship with spiritual practice. And the litmus test of the actuality of this shift is when we see that more and more, if and when we do slip, that we do not enter a state of contrition to the extent that it takes us away from having a better opinion of God and feeling God's nearness. When this begins happening more amidst our practice, then you can rest assured, in a sense, never rest assured, but you can rest in knowing that your sense of gratitude is persistent, and that you have not relied on your own works to try to reach God, for He has already reached you. And having this awareness transforms our relationship with not only our actions, but also when we seek forgiveness, while maintaining the courtesy towards God of awe, to not losing hope in God's generosity, His grace, and His love. For there's many aspirants who fall off the path after recognizing that they failed miserably in the consistency of practice, or even in a sense of feeling that they're unable to concentrate. Some fall off the path. And the whole point here is self-knowledge in the context of God awareness, of the awareness of the all-encompassing nature of the divine love and knowing. And so much of this hikam has everything to do with this. And it is natural to actually feel that we are blocked off from God after sinning. And this is indeed the case on some level. But it's important to know that we have blocked ourselves off, in effect, for God is already and always near. Even amidst our turning from Him, God is still present. And if we are aware of this, then our efforts in returning to our inner center will be helped. And oftentimes spirituality in this context and even in this stage is the art of refinding our center presence with Allah. That is our presence of heart. And much of this work, much of this inner work is the inner work of knowing ourselves in God's presence. And it is through this kind of work that we become more sensitive to those elements in us, those tendencies in us that take us away from a remembrance of God, from the remembrance of God, and from a more constant remembrance of God. We begin to see in our Muhasaba after Muraqaba with God's grace and presence, we begin to see more in our Muhasaba in the practice of constant, adhkar and the remembrances of God. What thoughts, actions, feelings, attitudes obstruct us from the ever-present grace and mercy and love of God. And this really constitutes the path of shukr, because then we seek to purify or refine ourselves from that which obstructs us in the context of being grateful for what God has already provided. And so wanted to mention that we went over, we covered a lot of ground on page 17 regarding this rule of threes that Shaykh Ibn Ajiba loves to actually use, and which will also figure into the book I'm writing on the practice of presence in Islamic spirituality, both in a practical sense, but actually in this kind of schematic sense of the spiritual work, where he speaks about the Sharia or sacred law, the tariqah, spiritual way, and haqiqah, the divine reality. And even speaks of spirituality on the level of the sacred law is to put our limbs right, to enact a participation of our limbs, the 7 limbs, in God's work, to conform these limbs to God's will on the level of the sacred law by avoiding the prohibitions and by participating in or obeying the commandments of God. And these 7 limbs, again, are the hearing, are the sight, are the tongue, is the tongue in terms of speech, are the hands, are the stomach, are the private parts, and are the feet. These are the 7 limbs that constitute the bodily actions that either take us away from God and reinforce the Nafs or the ego self, or bring us towards God by obeying the commands of God and staying away from that which distances us from God by incurring, one could say, distance from God, or what one could say is the anger of God. In this Surah Al-Fatiha, we ask God to guide us along the straight path, the path of those whom you have favored, whom you have bestowed your grace, ultimately of sanctity and prophecy, and not the path of those whom have earned your anger. Nor the path of those who are astray, who have gone astray and who have gone far off the mark. And so this concept of earning the anger of God is important. God is not, astaghfirullah, angry by his nature. And he is actually in reality not angry at us, but we earn his wrath by turning from him. And so in many ways we damn ourselves by that, by simply, and it's the miracle of the human state that we have the ability or the conscious will or the conscious choice to turn away from God. And even in that, because of the permission of God in that, is a kind of ontological submission to the will of God for the human state. Although all of creation naturally submits to the divine order of the divine will for them, what's called the ontological command of God. We, on the other hand, as human beings endowed with conscious awareness and self-awareness and this sense of free will and free choice to choose, can choose something that is other than God and thereby subhuman or below our human stature or below our human spiritual potential. And in this, we veil ourselves, we cover ourselves from our natural state, and we begin feeling it by the suffering, etc., by the sense of feeling distanced. Now, in many ways, the art of spirituality is to realize and to recognize that even amidst that, God is already present. God is always present. And the art of turning back unto God's presence is really the essence of all authentic spirituality. And this is what we call Toba, actually. Shaykh, Ibn Ajiba, in his commentary, speaks of Toba, taqwa, and istiqama. I don't want to say too much more about that, but just the tripartites are very, very important. He speaks of the limbs working with Toba, Toba from the effects and the actions. First of all, the actions, the acting out of the limbs in disobedience, and then its effects, you could say, upon the heart and upon the self. To do Toba from this, and to have taqwa to enhance our sense of conscious awareness of God, and then to be steadfast in embodying that presence on the realm or in our outer embodiment of the limbs. This is the work of the sacred law. Then we have a more subtle practice that is the work of the heart. So the first is the work of the limbs. The second is the work of the spiritual heart, where the actions of the heart we become more sensitive to, which is the muraqaba, mushahada, and ma'rifah. Shaykh Ibn Ajiba makes the point that one can't go from one level to the other level until one has fully achieved, if you will, a station on these levels in terms of the outer, the law, and the limbs, working our spirituality there, and then to the level of tariqa, or the heart, and then the level of haqiqa, which would be the sir, or the pure spirit. But in reality, although he is talking ideally about stations, your firm standing, in spirituality, we are actually more or less at the least working on the first two levels, always, especially in spirituality. If you have met a teacher, especially, and you have an awakened heart in some way by connection, spiritual connection, you're working both on the level of the limbs and the heart. And the more you awaken to the heart, the more you realize that the more work that you do on the level of the heart, it will immediately affect your limbs, the work on the limbs. And so one of the subtleties is that once the heart is more awakened and we have more of a tasting of the heart and the wonders of the heart, then simply by being vigilant or sensitive to our muraqaba, our watchfulness of God's presence, our sense of presence of heart with God, the more we work on that, then by natural consequence that will radiate into our expression of obeying God on the limbs. And so once this is existentially experienced enough, there is a shift in the salik in which more of the concern becomes the heart. Let us recall the hadith of the Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, that there is a part of the body that when it is ill, the whole body is ill. And when it is sound or healthy, the whole body is healthy. In other words, and that is the heart. In other words, if the heart or the spiritual heart becomes more healthy and you're working more with it, it will naturally relate to the body and cause it to become more healthy. And so what will flow is this taqwa, conscious presence of God, into the limbs naturally by virtue of being vigilant on the level of the heart, since the heart in terms of our human consciousness is a bit more subtle than our more outward embodiment of that consciousness as the body and the limbs. So the more we work there, we catch ourselves and we become more vigilant with spiritual attitudes, inward orientations, spiritual emotions, and spiritual thoughts, which then, of course, translate into being expressed as actions. For if you look carefully and if you do a muhasaba of your sins, how do sins start? They start with a thought and then a feeling about it, and then at some point a determination or hum to regarding it. And then the momentum of the irada, if you will, or the desire, which is really the shahwa at this point, to act out that sin will then make one act it out at some point, and then you're embodying it in actions on the level of the limbs. But you see that the process first started inwardly. in the heart and the mind. And so if you work there, if you become sensitive to recognizing when the thought arises, when the feelings arise, when you hit this point of no return or the determination of the desire itself, um, if you're able to work on this and be more sensitive, this is a way and a means of reversing the effects of those embodied actions on the heart. And these are the things or the matters of the heart, of those things that have preoccupied our heart and have turned us away from God, since there has been an attention or focus on in the heart on that which is other than God, by the traces of the actions that we've done in terms of sins, and by the desires that those traces or the tendencies that those effects have upon the heart in wishing or in desiring to act those out again for some kind of relief or due to some kind of compulsion or the momentum of the suggestion and the conditioning of the soul. So when we work here, it's a kind of working upstream, if you will. And one of the secrets of the path, one of the subtleties and its successes is when one is awakened to the heart, and when one begins to work on this level more. How does one become awakened to the heart? Precisely by the Dhikrullah, by the remembrance of God. And the more we remember God, the more we enact the remembrances of God. The more perpetual the remembrance of God becomes, the more that the dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is on our tongue and acted down on our limbs, the more it penetrates into the mind. And the more we think about it, uh, the more we remember God with every breath. The more we remember God with every breath, the more we feel God's presence in our heart. The more we feel God's presence in our heart as a form of dhikrullah, the more we become sensitive to when there are arisings of incoming and going or passing thoughts and feelings on the level of the heart that seem to somehow try to pull out or pull us out of our remembrance of God. And so the key to becoming more sensitive on this level of the Muraqaba, with the help of the support of contemplative methods like meditation and silent meditation, is the work that you put in with the remembrance of God, with the invocation of God's names and the divine formulas. The more one does this, the more sensitivity that one has, and the more one has a sense of the muraqabah, that is the first level of the heart, of the inner working of the heart, to get, as Ibn Ajiba says, to get the heart straight, to get the qalb right, by our vigilance with our sense of remembrance of God and with its effects. With this, this becomes the very measure or the light that we shine on ourselves in muhasaba, in regards to becoming more sensitive to when we have overwhelming thoughts that pull us out and push us into the desires and tendencies that lead to that which is other than God. And so this is the alchemical work, one could say, and the preciousness of dhikran kathira, of constant, repetitive, perpetual dhikr. As it penetrates our being, we become more sensitive to that which causes obstruction or our own heedlessnesses. Ghaflah, Ghaflah. So I pray that that's helpful in regards to situating this. And the more that we are in a state of heart presence, of muraqabah, and the more that we are concentrated and gathered in our attention and are in our hearts in the context of our remembrance of God, the more that we have this muraqabah or hudur al-qalb, the presence of heart, the more we begin to be opened unto the spiritual faculty, or the more that the more there is an awakening of the spiritual faculty of the heart, or the eye of the heart, that procures more of a witnessing of the divine blessings and the meanings of things as related to the signs of God in our mashahada. And the anwar and the lights, the angelic lights that God sends in regards to the spiritual perception and the organ of the eye of the heart, which is more awakened by the muraqaba of our dhikr. The more this happens, there is a heightened sensitivity to feeling intimately God's presence in the heart, which we go then from the muraqaba to mushahada, and finally to such an intimacy with God that we know Him directly, ma'rifah, by pure tasting, by direct experience. We know His presence as our very inmost self, as our most truest self, ma'rifah. We then realize or awaken to and are open to and bestowed upon by Allah in being an arif billah. And then it is as if we see God by God and not by us, for that is impossible. This is why the Prophet ﷺ says to worship God as if you see Him, ka'annaka tarahu, as if you see Him. For your as ifness in this subtle plane of spiritual witnessing is ultimately seen to be actually God's own seeing of Himself through the medium of your heart. And this is what the heart is made for. To know God this intimately, and for Allah to know Himself through your heart as a kind of mirror. And so the heart becomes a mirror, reflecting the divine lights. And the polish for this mirror that gets dirtied up by our tendencies, by our thoughts, by our feelings and emotions and the effects of our actions, the polish for all of that is the remembrance of God in all its modalities, from the ibadat to the mu'milat to having the mujahada. We're working on emptying ourselves of our vices and filling ourselves with the Muhammadan virtues, with the prophetic virtues, with the divine attributes. And this is what polishes the heart, because these are all modes of the remembrance of God, and with constant invocation and remembrance of God, constant reflection on God's signs, understanding God's bounties, His nature, etc., enlightening our mind and our intellect, etc., all of these, and acting out very beautiful virtue, participating in very beautiful spiritual virtues of compassion, of nobility, of forbearance, of courage, of patience, of contentment, of love. All right. So I think this covers most of what I wanted to say. I wanted to make the connection finally here in regards to these rules of three with just as we have the sacred law or sharia, tariqa, and hakika, they correspond as objectively speaking to the human subject, the aspects of our subjective human consciousness, which would be the spiritual heart, qalb, the qalb, or you could say the intellect, qalb, and sir. You could put this tripartite. When we are working and when we understand the ahkam of Allah and what this means by our faith and by our intelligence, we have activated our intellect, the aqal. And this is what helps our limbs get back into right practice. And then right orientation is the working of the heart. Right? And this is the level of tariqa, and this is qalb itself. Right? On this level, especially of those who are of an intellectual type, the illuminated mind, or the mind or intellect illuminated by spiritual doctrines, by subtle insights of the Sufis, will reinforce this sense and this need for seeking God and having certitude of the divine reality. And so this constitutes part of the work of the heart for the level of tariqa. And then we have haqiqa and the sir, which is the inmost secret of human consciousness. And it should be understood that all of these layers of consciousness, from the qalb, ruh, sir, or aqal, qalb, and sir, however you want to make the tripartite designations, that they all arise or are actually upon the same locus of awareness as the center of our being, that we awaken by the remembrance of God. When it is still slightly obscured and mixed with our outer selfhood, this is the outer heart, or the qalb itself. And we're working there to be more vigilant in Muraqaba. When it is more refined and more sensitive to that which takes us out of this this divine presence and allows us to facilitate staying there, we awaken to the ruh, or the more inner heart. And then finally, we realize our secret with God, our sir, and that this truly is the place or the realm of ma'rifah. And so you can see the concordance between these two ways, the outer or the objective and the inner. Right? Sharia, tariqa, haqiqa, aqal, qalb, and sir, if you will. All right. And so, although he says moving from one station, from the station, spiritual station, that is of the sacred law, to the spiritual station of the tariqah, the spiritual way, and the spiritual station of haqiqah, or the divine reality, one must have mastered one station and then move to the next. Yes, in principle, that is accurate. In fact, we are usually working on multiple levels of our own consciousness and our own being. And this is an important point that I wanted to actually make. All right. Let me move on in reading the rest of Ibn Ajiba's commentary on this particular very beautiful hikam that is again very comprehensive. See my time check. We've hit. All right. Well, okay. In traveling through these stations, the murid should not rely on himself or his own actions, power, or strength. He should only rely on the bounty of his Lord, his granting him success and his direction and guidance. Allah says, your Lord creates and chooses whatever he wishes. The choice is not theirs. He also states, if your Lord had wanted to, he would have made mankind into one community, but they persist in their differences except for those your Lord has mercy upon. Now, the Prophet ﷺ said, none of you will enter the garden by virtue of his actions. They asked, not even you, O Messenger of God? He said, not even me, unless God envelopes me in his mercy. So reliance on the lower self, on the Nafs, is a sign of misery and wretchedness. Reliance on, and so this paragraph is a very important one. So I will read this, and in the interest of time, I need to move on, inshallah. But basically, the whole point of this hikam is that when we feel bad after we've sinned and we go off track in regard to the consistency of our practices due to making us slip and are overwhelmed by that, it's a mark for us, it's a sign for us that we have relied on our own self, on the human side of this equation to try to reach God. It's God who reaches us. We do not reach God, but almost in paradox or irony, we have to have the intention and we have to strive, knowing that it will be in God's time, not our time. Right? With sincerity, your spiritual opening may happen at your death, or it may happen before your death. You may die before you die. And it is said in the Shadili order that one will at the least have their fath at the time of death. In regards to being connected to the order and connected to the practices. So reliance on the lower self, on the nafs, is a sign of, a sign of misery and wretchedness. Reliance on action comes from lack of certainty that all things will come to an end. This is a profound insight. It's very subtle. He says it in one line, but it's a beautiful intellectual proof for why you should not be relying on your actions in regards to meeting or seeking or becoming or reaching God. The reason why is because God is infinite. God is eternal. And your actions are contingent. They come and they go. They have a beginning and they have an end. How can you reach that which is beginningless and that which is endless by something that is contingent as your own actions? It's a very profound insight he gives in one sentence. Reliance on action comes from lack of certainty that all things will come to an end. And I would add in parentheses, except God, who has no end or no beginning. Right? So even having an awareness of that, we are then somehow in our iman, with God, with God's presence. Reliance on generosity and states, meaning reliance on the divine generosity and states, comes from reliance, I'm sorry, on your own states. When you feel certain openings in your heart, and then you're so happy that you've gained some kind of nearness, but then it falls away, and then you feel like you've been depossessed or deposed by God. This kind of reliance comes from a lack of actually being in the company of the real men of God, who would teach you otherwise, who would advise you otherwise. Um, Reliance on Allah comes from realization of direct knowledge of Allah. So every point he has made here is a point that points that is a pointer for a conscious awareness and for the spiritual intelligence. And every Salik has this in principle. There are some who have more of a propensity to spiritual intelligence, along the path. But by the end of the path, or even by the middle, these faculties have been awakened, having spiritual insight, having a discernment about many things. These things become awakened. There's some at the beginning of the path who do not have a strong irada or will, and this is obviously eventually cultivated. And there's others whose inner orientations or their emotional states may not be as in conformity with the prophetic emotions or the prophetic states of forbearance, generosity, etc. And then one has to cultivate that. But at some point, everyone meets. So if these are like the three elements of the human soul, in terms of the intelligence and the will and the affect, some are stronger on one of these, like one of these elements in the beginning of the path. And the mercy of Allah is that there are a diversity of paths that cater to each one of these kind of sentiments or elements, rather, of the soul, to the intelligence, to the will, and to the affect. There are certain orders that emphasize pure service. There's certain orders that emphasize a lot of metaphysical knowledge. There's other orders that emphasize the inner attitude cultivated, right? Now, at some point, everyone, if you are, you could say, progressing, or if you become a matured seeker, spiritually speaking, that you are given, or you realize some degree of spiritual maturity, all of these elements in your soul will come into a kind of balance. It will happen in an authentic path, and the teacher knows how to help you with that, and sees where you're strong and where you're a little bit limited in. And a lot of the work serves naturally to purify all of that and bring all of that into alignment, right? What other traditions called, for example, the path of karma yoga, or selfless kind of service, right? Or jnana yoga, which is pure self-knowledge, or the knowledge of the divine, which you could say is the Sufism of the scholars, right? Or of the metaphysicians, or the intellectuals, right? Where they have to combine their practice with the learning of sacred knowledge, a deep learning of sacred knowledge, right? And then you have, of course, those who have a beautiful character, so the Sufism of akhlaq, and so all of this is eventually the real Sufi, the one who is more matured, will awaken all of these faculties and will come to a kind of balance along the path. And there's a place for everyone, and the skillful teacher will be able to see the strengths in a particular seeker and will know how to help them find that balance and also strengthen what's already strong. Allahu Alam, and may this be the case for all of our teachers, all of our shuyukh. Okay. And so I will stop here, as there's so much that can be said. I will probably read, and so I will stop here. So I will attempt to do maybe one more day of Hikam, and then turn to Sayyidah Aisha al-Ba'uniya. I think I will stop here and go to the next Hikam for next time, and try to move a little bit faster on the Hikam, and probably not give a summary next time, as hopefully now everyone is caught up, so we can just move forward, so we can finish what we've intended. Let me read this very interesting paragraph regarding the spiritual teacher. It's still in this commentary on the Hikam. For this, in terms of spiritual work, it is essential for the seeker to have a perfected Shaykh who will bring him out of the toil and trouble of his lower self to the rest and ease of witnessing his Lord. A perfected teacher, a perfected Shaykh, a Shaykh Kamil, is the one who gives you rest from toil and trouble, not the one who directs you to that trouble. And then he quotes, I believe, Ibn Mashish. Whoever directs you to action alone tires you out. Whoever directs you to the world, they cheat you. And whoever directs you to Allah has been true to you. So this is a statement that helps kind of for the Salik to know if a teacher is a right fit for them or not. If they do not feel that the teacher is actually helping them in their wayfaring to come more near God by being directed more constantly, always back to God's presence in some way, shape, or form, this may be something for one to then look at as they discern where they are in the path, and if their teacher, who likely is authentic and so forth, is a real and skillful teacher, is perhaps not a good fit. And so I wanted just to mention that as Shaykh Ibn Mashish has said, all right, being directed unto Allah means being directed to forgetting the self. When you forget yourself, you remember your Lord. Allah Almighty says, remember your Lord when you forget. Quranic verse 18:24. Meaning that when you forget everything except God, you will have remembered your Lord. And so forgetting everything except God means also for forgetting yourself and not being so preoccupied with yourself. And just a small caveat here, or just a point. Some like to argue that Muhasaba can turn excessive, because then you're occupied with yourself and your own faults. If the intention of the Muhasaba is to learn that which takes you away from God, so that you can be more occupied with God, then your Muhasaba is sound. And you're learning a kind of knowledge of yourself and the workings of your Nafs as it works to obstruct you. But this must go in tandem with spiritual practices, with constant or more constant or a routine of the remembrance of God, which opens your heart to the sensitivity of God's presence. So we'll stop here, inshallah, and I intend to try to be more essential in the other hikams that we will speak of by tomorrow, and then the following day we'll turn to the text of Sayyidah Aisha, al-Ba'uniyah. So inshallah, one more day with the hikam. Please bear with me. I pray that what I have said has been helpful, and feel free to those who are also on our WhatsApp to ask questions regarding what I've asked here or what I've said here. Feel free to ask here and or on the WhatsApp, and that may be helpful to you all. Feel free to type anything in if you'd like. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. السلام عليكم.